The church bell's whisper died instantly when the first scream split the night. Pastor Jacob Miller froze. Something was very wrong. Arlington's streetlights flickered like dying candles as James Walker approached North Point Baptist Church. His hands, calloused from years of desperate survival, clutched something hidden beneath his worn jacket. This wasn't just another night. This was the night everything would change. Inside the empty sanctuary, shadows danced across wooden pews. Jacob's fingers traced the edge of his desk, feeling a coldness that had nothing to do with temperature. Years of preaching about redemption hadn't prepared him for what was coming. Sarah Thompson, the church secretary, stopped typing. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating. Something pressed against her consciousness, a warning she couldn't explain. Her computer screen glowed, illuminating her pale face. 10:47 p.m. The clock seemed to hold its breath. Outside, James Walker's shadow stretched across the church steps. His past was a graveyard of broken promises, abandoned dreams. Tonight, he wasn't just a man walking into a church. He was a match about to ignite something explosive. One moment would change everything. One decision would shatter their world. And no one, not Jacob, not Sarah, not anyone in Arlington, had any idea what was coming. James Walker pushed open the heavy church doors, careful to keep the sound of the creak as quiet as possible. His breath came in shallow gasps, a mix of fear and anticipation flooding his chest. The church, usually so bright and welcoming during the day, felt cold and foreboding in the darkness. The silence felt almost suffocating as he crept inside, glancing around to ensure no one had noticed his presence. He had been in this church before, but never like this. He had sat in the back pews during a Sunday service, but tonight it was different. Tonight, he wasn't just a visitor. He was here to steal whatever he could find. James had heard rumors about valuables locked away in the church office, and he knew this was his chance. His life had spiraled out of control, addiction, debt, and bad choices. He was running out of time. He needed to get out of this mess, and the church felt like his only option. Pastor Jacob Miller had no idea that James had entered the church. He was focused on something else, his own thoughts and worries about the church. As he sat at his desk, he shuffled through papers, his mind distracted. He hadn't even heard the footsteps creeping closer to his office. Sarah, on the other hand, was still sitting at her desk, oblivious to the danger that was about to arrive. The faint noise of the door opening had gone unnoticed. It was only when she heard the footsteps grow louder and closer that she looked up from her work. Her heart skipped a beat as she saw a figure standing in the doorway, a man she didn't recognize, holding something shiny in his hand. "Oh, who are you?" she stammered, her voice quivering with fear. James didn't answer right away. He stepped into the room, his eyes scanning the office quickly. The smell of old paper and the faint scent of incense filled the air. His eyes locked onto Sarah's, and he saw the fear in her eyes. "I don't want any trouble," she said, standing up from her chair, her hands instinctively reaching for the phone on the desk. James's breath quickened. He wasn't here to talk. He wasn't here to negotiate. Desperation filled him as he raised the weapon he had hidden under his jacket. A blunt object, something to intimidate. "Give me the money," he demanded, his voice low and cold. Sarah froze, unsure of what to do. "Please," she said softly, her eyes pleading. "You don't have to do this. Please just leave. We can call the police." But James was past the point of reasoning. "I need this. I need it now." He snapped, his grip tightening around the weapon. Suddenly, the office door creaked open. Pastor Miller stood in the doorway, looking confused. He had heard the commotion and had come to check on Sarah. His eyes widened as he saw the situation unfolding before him. "James, stop!" Pastor Miller shouted, stepping forward, his hands raised in a peaceful gesture. "You don't have to do this. We can help you." But it was too late. The tension in the room reached a breaking point, and before anyone could react, the situation spiraled out of control. The silence that followed was deafening. James's eyes darted between the two people in the room, his breathing ragged. He had expected to intimidate them, but now the reality of the situation hit him like a punch to the gut. He had come here to rob them, to take whatever he could and escape. But now, Something darker was unfolding, and there was no turning back. Pastor Miller's voice remained calm, his hands still raised. "James, it's not too late. Put the weapon down, and we'll figure this out together." But the words only seemed to fuel James's panic. His mind raced, and his hands shook as he gripped the object harder. "You don't get it. I need this. I can't go back. I can't live like this anymore," he mumbled, his voice breaking. In an instant, it happened. James lunged at the pastor, striking him across the face with a brutal force. Pastor Miller stumbled backward, crashing into the desk with a sharp thud. Blood began to seep from his lip, but he pushed himself up, his face contorted in pain, but still trying to maintain control of the situation. The violence continued to escalate as Sarah screamed in terror. She tried to run, but James was too fast. He turned on her, grabbing her by the wrist and pulling her back to the desk. In that moment, the weight of the church's calm atmosphere was replaced with something much darker, a sense of impending doom that filled the room. Pastor Miller, his heart pounding in his chest, tried again to stop James. "Please stop. Think about what you're doing. You're hurting people." But James didn't listen. His mind had gone blank in a rush of adrenaline and fear. He saw only one way out, and it wasn't through conversation. The violence consumed him. The next few minutes were a blur, fists flying, a struggle for control. Pastor Miller tried to fight back, but the damage had been done. With terrifying speed, James wrapped a plastic bag around Pastor Miller's neck, tightening it until the life drained from him. The once kind and compassionate pastor was now lifeless. His body slumped against the desk, a grim reminder of how quickly everything had gone wrong. Sarah, still struggling against James's grip, could hardly breathe as she watched the unthinkable unfold before her. She couldn't comprehend what was happening. Her mind raced. Should she run? Should she fight? But every instinct told her to stay down, to wait for the right moment. The room was spinning, and in the haze of fear, she barely noticed when James dropped the weapon and turned his attention to her once more. James stood over the body of Pastor Miller, panting heavily, his face twisted with a mixture of fear and disbelief. The church, once a place of peace, now felt like a tomb. Silence hung heavy in the room, broken only by the distant hum of the air conditioning. But the silence didn't last long. From outside the office, the creak of the church's heavy front doors echoed down the hall. James's head snapped toward the sound. Someone was coming. Panic surged through him like a wildfire. He turned quickly toward Sarah, who was still on the ground, gasping for breath, trying to summon the strength to move. Without thinking, James grabbed her roughly by the arm and dragged her toward the back door of the church. She cried out in pain, her body barely able to keep up with the force of his pull. Every step felt like it could be her last. "Stay quiet," he hissed. His voice was tight with panic, his grip unrelenting. But even in her disoriented state, Sarah knew something was wrong, far beyond the physical pain. Something in the air had shifted, something dark and irreversible. Just as they neared the back door, Sarah heard footsteps. The churchgoer, the one who always came early to prepare the sanctuary, was close. She had no idea how much time had passed, but she knew she had to act fast. With a final burst of strength, Sarah jerked her arm free from James's grip, stumbling to the side. She collapsed to the floor, gasping for air as her eyes darted toward the door. "Please, God, help me," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Her only hope now was survival. The churchgoer, Mrs. Walker, an older woman who had been coming to the church for years, opened the door and gasped in shock at the sight before her. The office was a mess. Papers scattered everywhere, bloodstains on the floor, and Pastor Miller's lifeless body still slumped against the desk. Sarah was kneeling on the ground, her clothes torn, her face bruised. "Sarah," Mrs. Walker cried, rushing toward her, her voice shaking. She knelt beside Sarah, trying to help her up. "What happened? What is going on here?" Sarah could barely speak. Her mind was still reeling from the events that had unfolded in the last few minutes. He killed him. Pastor Miller, I couldn't stop him." Her voice trailed off into a sob. Mrs. Walker quickly pulled out her phone and dialed 911. her hands trembling as she explained the situation. Sarah could barely focus on the conversation, her mind still grappling with the horror she had witnessed. In the distance, she could hear the faint wail of sirens approaching, but even that felt distant. It didn't take long for the police to arrive, filling the church with flashing lights and uniformed officers. The scene was chaotic, but in the midst of it all, Detective Lisa Grant remained calm. She surveyed the church with a practiced eye, noticing the small details. The broken furniture, the signs of a struggle, and most of all, the lifeless body of Pastor Miller. Detective Grant was no stranger to violent crimes, but something about this one felt different. The brutality of it. The fact that it had happened in a place of worship where people came for solace. It wasn't just a robbery gone wrong. It was something much darker. She turned to one of the officers who had been questioning Sarah. "Get a statement from her. We need to know everything. Every detail." Sarah's statement was clear. She described the man she had seen, James Walker. She recalled his nervousness, his violent outbursts, and the way he had hurt both her and Pastor Miller. Sarah's memory was still hazy, but there was no doubt in her mind. She had seen him before around town. James Walker had been a familiar face. The police began to search for James immediately. The investigation moved fast, as the evidence quickly pointed to him as the primary suspect. The description Sarah had given, combined with the bloodstains left at the scene and his previous criminal history, led them to his apartment just hours after the crime. When they found him, James didn't put up a fight. He was slumped on his couch, eyes wide with a mix of fear and resignation. He didn't try to deny it. He didn't say much at all. As the handcuffs were placed around his wrists, he muttered a single sentence, almost to himself. "I didn't mean for it to go this far." The trial began in a small, crowded courtroom. The people of Arlington, still reeling from the violent crime that had shattered their peaceful community, gathered to witness the proceedings. It was hard to believe that just a few weeks ago, this had been a town where neighbors waved to each other and churchgoers filled the pews every Sunday. Now, the air felt heavy with grief and confusion. Sarah Thompson sat in the courtroom, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. She had been through so much in the last few weeks, physically recovering from her injuries, reliving the horror of that night, and now, watching the man responsible for it all stand trial. He sat across from her in the defendant's chair, his face pale and haunted, his eyes avoiding hers. James Walker looked like a different person than the one she had seen in the church. He wasn't the desperate man who had burst into the office that night. Now he seemed small, broken, but Sarah knew the truth. The man in front of her had taken the life of someone who had been like a brother to her, someone who had always been there when the community needed him. Pastor Miller's absence was a hole that could never be filled. The prosecutor, a sharp and determined woman named Victoria Hall, was ready. She laid out the case against James with precision, pointing to the physical evidence, Sarah's testimony, and the chilling brutality of the crime. It was clear from the evidence that James had not only murdered Pastor Miller, but had nearly taken Sarah's life as well. His actions were cold and calculated, and it was hard to imagine any reason that could justify such violence. James Walker entered that church with the intent to rob, Prosecutor Hall said, her voice steady. But when confronted, he chose a different path, one that led to murder. He killed a man of God in his own church, and he almost killed a woman who was simply doing her job. There is no excuse for that. James's defense attorney, a man named Leonard Harris, tried to make his case, though it felt weak in comparison. He argued that James had been struggling with addiction and a difficult past, and that the violence was a result of his deteriorating mental state. He painted James as a victim of circumstances, a man who had never been given a chance. But Sarah knew the truth. She had seen the desperation in James's eyes that night. She had heard his words, felt the fear in his grip. There was no excuse for what he had done. He had made a choice, an awful, tragic choice that no amount of hardship could justify. When it was Sarah's turn to testify, she stood before the court, her hands trembling. The memories flooded back as she spoke, the terror, the helplessness, the final moments she had shared with Pastor Miller. She told the court about how he had tried to protect her, even in his last breath, how he had been a symbol of kindness and faith, and how his life had been taken so brutally. "I never wanted this," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "I just wanted to help. I didn't deserve this, but he didn't deserve to die either." James didn't look up as she spoke. His eyes were cast downward, and he didn't seem to have the courage to face the woman he had nearly killed. The trial moved quickly after that. The jury deliberated for only a few hours before returning with a verdict: guilty of first-degree murder and attempted murder. The judge, a stern but fair man, sentenced James to death, and the courtroom erupted in a mix of emotions. Some felt justice had been served, while others were left questioning the very nature of it. The days leading up to James Walker's execution were filled with tension and uncertainty. For many, justice had been served, but for others, the question remained, was this the right outcome? In the months following the trial, the town of Arlington remained divided. Some people found solace in knowing that the man responsible for such horror would face the ultimate punishment. Others, like Sarah, couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it all than simply met the eye. James had spent his last days on death row in a small, sterile cell, far from the life he had once known. The world outside had moved on, but for him, the clock was ticking. The execution date was set, and there would be no last-minute reprieve. As the day of his execution approached, James began to write letters to his family, to the church, to anyone who might still care. The letters were filled with remorse, regret, and a longing for forgiveness. He had come to terms with what he had done, though he knew that nothing could ever undo the pain he had caused. He was a man broken by his past, and the consequences of his choices had brought him to this final moment. In his cell, James had frequent visits from a prison chaplain. The chaplain spoke to him about redemption, about the possibility of finding peace before his death. James wasn't sure he believed in redemption, not after everything he had done, but the words gave him a small sense of comfort. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of something like hope. "I'm sorry," he said softly to the chaplain one afternoon. "I don't know if I can be forgiven, but I am sorry. I know that's all I can give now." Meanwhile, Sarah Thompson struggled with her own emotions. The trauma of that night had left scars that no one could see. She had tried to move on, to heal, but she couldn't shake the image of Pastor Miller's lifeless body. She couldn't stop thinking about James and the choices he had made. She wanted to feel peace, but all she felt was an overwhelming sadness. She visited Pastor Miller's grave often, standing silently by his headstone, remembering the man who had shown her kindness, who had tried so hard to protect her. She prayed for him, for his family, and for herself. She prayed that one day she would find the strength to forgive, though she knew it wouldn't be easy. On the day of the execution, Sarah sat at home, her hands folded in her lap. She had been told that the execution would be broadcast, that the world would witness the final chapter of James Walker's life. She didn't know if she could watch it. She didn't know if it would bring any closure, or if it would only open old wounds. The prison was buzzing with activity as the guards prepared for the final moment. James was escorted into the execution chamber, his steps slow and measured. He had been stripped of his personal belongings and was now facing the ultimate consequence for his actions. His mind was clouded with a mixture of fear and acceptance, but he had made his peace. At least he thought he had. The cameras clicked, and the witnesses took their seats. James was strapped to the gurney, the cold metal against his skin. The air felt thick, heavy with the weight of the moment. The executioner stood by, ready to carry out the sentence that had been handed down by the court. "I'm sorry," James whispered one last time, his voice barely audible. "I'm sorry for everything. I never meant to hurt anyone." The lethal injection was administered, and within moments, James's body went still. The room remained quiet, except for the sound of the medical team confirming his death. The world outside continued on, but for those who had been impacted by his actions, the moment felt like the end of a long, painful chapter. The news of the execution spread quickly through Arlington, and the reactions were mixed. Some felt a sense of justice, believing that James had paid the price for the violence he had committed. Others, like Sarah, weren't sure how to feel. In the weeks that followed, the church held a memorial for Pastor Miller, with Sarah standing in the front, reading a passage from the Bible. The congregation gathered to honor his memory and to celebrate the life he had lived, a life dedicated to helping others. There were no words that could take away the pain of his loss, but there was a sense of healing in the gathering. It was a reminder that even in the face of darkness, there could still be light. Sarah, though forever scarred by the events that had unfolded, found a way to move forward. She continued working at the church, keeping Pastor Miller's legacy alive. She became a source of strength for others in the community, offering guidance and support to those who had been affected by the crime. But she never forgot. She never could. Months passed, and the town of Arlington slowly began to heal, though the scars of the tragedy remained. Life moved on, as it always does, but the impact of that night, the violence, the loss, and the execution, was never far from the hearts of those who lived through it. The church, once a symbol of peace, had been forever changed by the brutal crime that had taken place within its walls. Sarah Thompson, though she had come a long way in her own healing, knew that she would never fully recover from the trauma of that night. She still heard the echoes of the struggle, the sound of Pastor Miller's voice trying to calm James, the sickening finality of his death. It haunted her, but she had learned to live with it, to carry the weight of the memories with her, even as she moved forward. She still visited Pastor Miller's grave, though not as often as she once did. Now, when she stood before his headstone, it wasn't just a reminder of the tragedy. It had become a place of solace, a place where she could remember the man who had been a friend, a mentor, and a protector. The pain of his loss would never fade, but the memory of his kindness was something she could hold on to. The church, too, had found a way to move on. The members of the congregation, shaken but resilient, began to rebuild the community they had once known. They honored Pastor Miller's memory in every service, in every act of kindness they showed to one another. The church became a place of healing, a symbol that even in the darkest of times, there was always hope. But even as they rebuilt, the questions remained. Could they ever truly forgive? Could they ever fully understand the reasons behind the crime that had stolen so much from them? Sarah didn't have the answers. She didn't know if anyone did. What she did know was that the cycle of violence, of pain, of grief, could only end when people chose to heal, when they chose to remember the good and let go of the hatred that threatened to consume them. As for James Walker, his name would forever be tied to the tragedy. His death would never bring closure to the pain he had caused. But in the small, quiet town of Arlington, life had moved on, and the people had begun to find peace in their own ways. For Sarah, it meant carrying on Pastor Miller's work, helping others, offering comfort, and finding strength in the community that had supported her through it all. In the end, the story of that night, the violence, the loss, and the execution was just one chapter in a much larger story. It was a story about resilience, about the human spirit's ability to survive even the darkest moments. And though the pain would never go away, the people of Arlington would continue to move forward, finding light in the places where darkness had once reigned.